Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to go through the gallery walk that we went through today because I think this would be a great source of review for your next unit exam. And so first I wanted to say that I drew inspiration for this gallery walk when I was creating it from an article titled "This Second Reconstruction." And what that article does, it's written in the Atlantic, and I'll include the link in the description of this YouTube video. It really tries to draw a link between the Reconstruction amendments and sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that we've seen recently, and everything in between, right? It does a really good and interesting article that I'll include in the description. But I also wanted to say that because we're also going to be talking about other social movements in this class, and thinking about the application of these constitutional amendments and principles to other social movements as well, such as gay rights, Chicano movements, also pro-life movements, etc. And so here, document 1, when you start at the gallery walk, we have my favorite amendment, the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. And we can see the 14th Amendment does something interesting, right? So the Bill of Rights, when we studied it, we saw that it placed restrictions on the federal government. The 14th Amendment, we can see here, is placing restrictions on the states. It also establishes this principle of birthright citizenship. It says as long as you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. Which is this radical idea at the time because previously citizenship was defined by race. And it also says that there are certain privileges and immunities of citizens, right? There's something special attached to being a citizen. And then it says states can't deny you life, liberty, or property without due process of law. We've talked about types of due process in this class. Procedural due process is the idea that we need a standard system because we can't just arbitrarily deprive people of life, liberty, or property because that leads to unjust application of the laws. And then finally, this last clause, which is so powerful, the equal protection of the laws. No state can deny you the equal protection of the laws. Super important clauses of the Constitution. The 15th Amendment we can see here expands suffrage to African American males specifically. These amendments are by no means, and the 13th Amendment, this is the documentary 13th. I didn't put the 13th Amendment up here, but the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. These amendments are by no means perfect, but they're really good. They kind of seem to fulfill initially the first attempt to try to establish a multiracial democracy. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, sort of restricted and narrowly interpreted these amendments. There's a great scholarly book about that. They restricted and narrowly interpreted these amendments and kind of ushered in an age of racial segregation and sort of Jim Crow laws, helped facilitate that kind of darkness in our society. Specifically, if we think about in 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court is presented with this ability to strike down racial segregation, right? And infamously, the court held that as long as segregated facilities were separate but equal, that it was not violative of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, right? The court also, through very complicated cases in the early 20th century, kind of suggests that there isn't really any special privileges or immunities associated with citizenship, right? So it kind of neuters that as a tool by which people can kind of expand their rights and liberties in our society. And also, the 15th Amendment, a very cynical interpretation and very cynical tactics by several states to deny African Americans the right to vote, such as the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, are essentially okayed by the Supreme Court. Finally, in 1875, the Supreme Court strikes down as unconstitutional a Civil Rights Act that many have even suggested is more radical than the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because although the 14th Amendment gives Congress the ability to enforce Section 1, which is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court didn't think that was enough constitutional basis for a Civil Rights Act. Then we continued, we saw this sort of ugly racism and Jim Crow laws. We saw the documentary 13th, we watched it, it's about mass incarceration. It talks about the 13th Amendment, it sort of tries to draw this line between the Reconstruction amendments and the present day. Then we move on, we can see right here several different types of protest tactics. We read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. We talked about natural law and King's philosophy. It was a very beautiful letter. I was very moved by your guys' analysis of it. And I'll include a link in the description of to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right? So he practiced civil disobedience, he emphasized nonviolence, but he also said that his goal was to generate tension in society to create change. Like he had this lovely line that time is not neutral. Malcolm X, advocates this black nationalism. He talks about the importance of his Second Amendment rights and stuff like that. We're going to read Ballard in the Bullet when we get into the political ideologies portion of this course because it's so interesting. He kind of sounds almost like a contemporary Republican in a lot of respects. And then document 5, this one is a bit out of place. Chronologically, the rest made sense. But document 5, I asked you to think about like the impact of electing Barack Obama on our society, right? So I showed you some nice pictures. This is a lovely book from Pete Souza, who used to be President Obama's White House photographer. You can see President Obama talking to Ferguson protesters and the bust of MLK in the foreground, and we can also see him with a group of civil rights activists crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we moved on back here. Document number 6 was the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So this is congressional action that is taking place. And Title II of the Civil Rights Act, pretty important, says that discrimination in public accommodations is illegal, and it gives the Justice Department the ability to enforce that. So it's a landmark piece of legislation. It still governs, it's still a very important piece of legislation in America today. It was very controversial at the time because there was this thought process that people that owned places of public accommodation like hotels and restaurants had a right to refuse service to people, and there was like this long train of jurisprudence that seemed to suggest that they may potentially have that. But when the Supreme Court exercised, I lost my magnifying glass. When the Supreme Court exercised judicial review of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, they determined that it was constitutional. We'll talk about how they determined it was constitutional, the basis for passing the Civil Rights Act, and the judicial review test is very interesting, very peculiar. Then we have this protest movement that happened in Memphis. I asked you to think about the impact of economic deprivation on protest movements, etc. Unfortunately, this is actually the protest movement where Dr. Martin Luther King gets assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. So a bunch of sanitation workers, kind of protesting their working conditions. And this is kind of out of place, but we can see here document 8. I asked you to think about sort of the backlash to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling that said racial segregation was violative of the Constitution of the United States, particularly the Warren Court, which I guess I can lift this up now. This is a picture of Earl Warren being heckled by protesters asking for him to be impeached, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, overturned that judicial precedent, because remember, Supreme Courts are not bound by stare decisis, the principle of letting the decision stand. They oftentimes like to let the decision stand, but they're not bound by it. Here we can see an image of Ruby Bridges being escorted by federal officers, U.S. Marshals, to integrate the Louisiana public school, and there's also harassment at the Little Rock Nine, who are integrating public schools. Right? So a lot of backlash. Document 9 dealt with the Voting Rights Act. Specifically, the Voting Rights Act tries to fulfill the promises of the 15th Amendment, because the 15th Amendment is effectively neutered by the Supreme Court in the 19th century. And we can see here we have recent Supreme Court majority opinion and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in the 2013 Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder. In Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act required certain states that had a history of discriminatory voting laws to go to the Justice Department or a federal court to seek pre-clearance before they changed their laws, right? Because these southern states were trying to find innovative ways, like poll taxes, unfortunately in the Jim Crow years, to deny African Americans the right to vote. So they had to go and prove that they weren't actually had discriminatory intent when they were trying to modify their voting laws. In 2013, the Supreme Court said that Congress needed to essentially come up with a new coverage formula to determine what states were still required to do this, because they said that it violated principles of federalism and the equal sovereignty between states. Ruth Bader Ginsburg issued a scathing dissent that said, although the majority in the Supreme Court had praised the Voting Rights Act for doing so much good, effectively issuing this decision was like tossing aside your umbrella during a rainstorm just because you weren't getting wet, right? Heralding the achievements of the Voting Rights Act and saying it was no longer needed was similar to tossing your umbrella in a rainstorm because you weren't getting wet. That was Ginsburg's famous dissent. Document 10, we can see mourners at Martin Luther King's funeral. Document 11, over here, we can see the Ferguson, Missouri protest, which happened while I was in high school. We can see a Justice Department report that says that the Ferguson Police Department had engaged in a series of unconstitutional conduct, particularly violating the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which protects people from unreasonable search and seizure, the First Amendment, and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So you can read this report, you can see the demonstrations, very similar to what we see in the summer of 2020, which is on this side. We can see sort of the uprisings that took place after the killing of George Floyd. And we are done. I'll provide resources in the description of this YouTube video. Hope this helps you out.